Hi, everyone. I hope that everybody's enjoying their day and hope that the weather's getting better around the nation. I'm based in Georgia and we had a nice 80-degree day today. So I hope that the new season begins to present itself because I know that winter can start to bring the winter blues with it, especially as we get into the thick of February and March. The isolation becomes a bit much for some of us. So I hope that as the temperature's warm, you guys begin to take advantage of it and start getting out there and breathing in that fresh air and getting some of that sunlight on your skin. But today I want to talk about the four most common childhood wounds that we see and the types of tendencies or personality traits that we develop because of those wounds and how we respond to them when those wounds are triggered. So, the four most common childhood wounds that we see are the rejection wound, the abandonment wound, the betrayal wound, and the injustice wound. So, those wounds will appear in our lives in lots of ways. Just to cover a few of the more common uh, characteristics that we tend to see, you may see them in your friends, in your relatives, or even in your colleagues at work. Um, you will see people who lack a sense of self, and that is very common with people who were children of addicts or narcissists. And when we don't develop a healthy sense of self, it's usually because our boundaries were never developed as we were growing up. If you were the child of an addict, you were probably busy trying to survive instead of live and set boundaries. Your boundaries were probably consistently crossed. You were violated. Um, you were forced to be the main caregiver. So it's hard to develop a sense of self when people don't respect your autonomy, who you are, and they don't respect you as you mature and become a young adult. There's really no barrier to how your caregivers interact with you. There's just a complete disregard to the level of respect that should be increasing as you mature and grow and get older. So a sense of self is really one of the biggest ways that we see that people have experienced some form of trauma in childhood. You may also have a tendency to self blame and over apologize. I know most of us have seen that person around us that everything they're sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. You even tell them, don't say sorry anymore. I'm sorry. They just, it just comes out of them. They can't stop saying sorry. And that's a very common characteristic in people who have suffered some form of trauma or disregard in their childhood. They think that everything is their fault. The tendency to feel shame and guilt is also a common characteristic, and that is really evident when we see people trying to set limits for themselves or do something for themselves. Perhaps you try to just take some personal time for yourself, or you don't want to be in a particular friendship or relationship anymore, but the amount of shame and guilt that you are dealing with is completely overwhelming. That you just rather forget the boundary that you were trying to set because you're just overwhelmed with guilt. And that is something that is usually trained and developed in you when you're young and your boundaries are crossed. So we have a continuation of that in people pleasers, people who tend to just go along. I'm sorry for my sniffling, but Georgia allergies are really doing me in. I've never suffered allergies in my life, but I've been on an allergy med here almost every day and they're still killing me. So I was warned by many people that that might happen, and it is. So bear with me. Back to people pleasing. People who people please have a big habit of really not being able to say what it is they want to do or even want to eat. They're really disconnected from their needs. You ask them what they want to eat, whatever you want. Where do you want to go? Wherever you want to go. What do you want to do? Whatever you want to do. They really never have a sense of self, a sense of I'm gonna put out my request and we're gonna go with the flow. It's just people pleasing all the way, whatever anyone wants to do. It's being always amicable. If you have plans and then they change the plans last minute, you're like, oh, okay. And maybe somewhere deep inside, you're like, ugh, but you don't even voice it. You just go along with the flow and you're just the people pleaser. You want to do everything to make people happy at the expense of your own happiness. Another way that people tend to show that they have one of these childhood wounds is that they over control or over plan. There are some people who they need to control everything. We see this a lot in leadership with bosses, or even moms who can tend to anyone really, because we know that we see a lot of men who just cannot relinquish control for anything. They find their purpose in control. But moms can do this also. They can be overbearing, constantly controlling everything their kids are doing, how they're doing it, how they're dressing. Everything has to be controlled. And there's the reason for this is that it kind of reduces their anxiety. If everything is controlled and everything is over planned, then I feel like I'm in control of things that I'm not really in control of. And it's usually because they don't have control in other areas of their life. So on these minor details that they are able to kind of exert themselves on, they can kind of feel that they have some control in their life or some control of the people around them and can anticipate the outcome of different situations. So that habit of control can also come off as the know-it-all personality. Even when they don't know what they're talking about, you mention a topic and they're adding in their 2 cents about what they believe it to be, what they think it is. And sometimes it can be really wild, but there's this need to always build themselves in a false way, to build their own self-esteem by feeling that I am smart, I am helpful, I can solve things for people, and there's an attempt to increase your self-value in that way. And it's not a healthy way. There's also the tendency to be jealous. There are just people who are jealous openly, but there are a lot of people who will not admit or even ever show you that they have a jealous tendency. They see people who are happy, they see people moving up, and there's just this underlying current of resentment and jealousy of, why not me? It's never going to be me, almost a self-loathing. And people who do this tend to carry a lot of shame. And again, they're not usually openly jealous, as when we see people who will say things that you immediately know when they say it, you're like, oh my gosh, she's so, such a jealous type of person. But people who are covertly jealous, they really do carry this sense of lack and self-worth, and that nothing good will really ever come to them, and they're kind of just watching as an outsider all these developments that are happening in other people's lives. This crow's driving me nuts. So we also have a tendency when we have one of these wounds to feel left out. We might even think that people are being malicious and intentional. If we have a certain group of friends and maybe you weren't invited or put on the group chat, or things were planned last minute and it was just a certain amount of people talking and somehow you got left out of that, there's a tendency to feel that people are maliciously keeping you out of things when that's not usually the case. That's usually a sign that you have some kind of a wound there that gets triggered whenever you feel that you are on the outside of things, and can make you defensive. We also see evidence of childhood wounds in people who are overly clingy or needy, or people who over pursue romantic interests. So we see this a lot in both males and females. People who really don't know how to take a hint, people who kind of ignore the red flags, or people who will accept breadcrumbs in a relationship or lack thereof. Perhaps you are really, giving your all and someone is refusing to commit or even label the type of relationship that you're in. They call you at their convenience. They're not responding to your text messages. Um, they call you at night, late in the evening. They only make plans with you on the weekends or only make plans with you on the week, and then the weekends they're MIA. And here you are consistently over pursuing them, maybe sending them gifts, calling them, sending them nice messages, sending them memes. You're really over pursuing a person who is just showing you the minimal interest that they can show you. And that usually shows some type of an abandonment wound and an inability to set boundaries, recognize red flags. And we often see that in people who have a love addiction, people who have developed the inability to be by themselves, people who jump from relationship to relationship and are actually anxious when they don't have somebody there. So that's a form of codependency that we develop when we have some of these childhood wounds. So I'm going to jump into what the four wounds are and a little bit more about the symptoms that we show when we have these wounds. I just kind of wanted to pique your interest and grab your attention to see if you recognize in yourself any of these tendencies to behave in these ways. So again, I go back to the four major childhood wounds, which were rejection, abandonment, betrayal, and injustice. So with rejection, we see that would actually be being rejected by your parents, your family, or your peers in childhood. So, a symptom of this childhood wound is really being unable to connect with your self worth. So, people who have a rejection wound tend to have this gnawing feeling of worthlessness. They feel undesirable. They feel that they really don't fit in anywhere in life. And so they have a hard time showing up as their authentic selves. They have a hard time setting boundaries because they're afraid that if they do these things, people will not accept them for who they are. If they really show people who they are and all their quirks and weird ways, people will not want to continue engaging with them. So that is one of the major childhood wounds. The other major childhood wound is the abandonment wound. And we see that so much in our society. We see children who are abandoned by their parents. Maybe only one parent is in the home. Maybe the parents were divorced. One parent seems to have kind of fallen off the face of the earth, and the connection with that parent has ended. And that really causes terrible abandonment wounds in children. So as an adult, you have these fears of being abandoned by friends and by lovers, and it really affects how you show up to your relationships with people. You will feel triggered, and you will feel triggered when, again, you feel left out of things, when you feel that people aren't constantly reassuring you of their presence in your life. And it's not just with romantic interest, it could be with a friend. If that friend doesn't call you all the time, or if that friend gets into a new relationship with someone and now you're not hearing from her as much, your abandonment wound will be triggered. You need constant reassurance that the person that you're engaging with is there with you. People with abandonment wounds have a feeling of loneliness. Even when they are supported and have a good network of people around them, they have this constant feeling of loneliness. They're so lonely. And often the reason for that, again, is because they're not showing up authentically to their relationships. They're very guarded with how they interact with people. And so they never really feel seen. They never really feel like the people around them know them. And they put that blame on other people. You don't know me. You don't understand me. You never understand where I'm coming from. But it's really because they're not showing up authentically to their relationships. They're not really being honest in their conversations with friends and lovers. Um, these people who have abandonment wounds, will be clingy. They will be needy. They will self sabotage. They will find ways to push people away and therefore have a self fulfilling prophecy of this limiting belief that has developed in their programming. So it's like a virus that's in the programming now that is not allowing you to function at your best self. You have this belief that people will leave you. So whenever you start to sense any kind of tension or conflict, you will be quick to send somebody to hell, say, I'm done with it, I don't care. You'll convince yourself that you're over it, and that will reduce your anxiety of feeling like this person's going to send me to hell. This person's going to abandon me. And so we tend to really pick partners who will abandon us, who are emotionally unavailable and unstable, because it's what's familiar to us from our childhood. And we don't realize that we are recreating and engaging the same types of dynamics that we had in our childhood because that feels like home to us. But in our fantasy head, we are hoping that things will be different and that this person will come through in an amazing way. And that's why people who have an abandonment wound tend to often fall in love with people who are abusive or narcissists. Because when you're falling in love with someone who is abusive, they're not showing up as their authentic self. And often there is a love bombing phase that is going on in the beginning. They're overly nice. They are overly responsive to your needs. They know exactly what to say. They know how to read you. They know what you're looking for. They know how to really reel you in. And for someone with abandonment wounds, the beginning of a relationship can be very scary for them. I'm going to talk within the next few days, I'm going to talk about the different types of attachment styles. So, someone who has an abandonment wound will normally have an anxious attachment style or a disorganized attachment style. And so, when you're meeting someone, even if it's not a romantic interest, but just a friend, there's an anxiety that's going on as you're getting to know this person. And as you're attaching to them, there's a fear there that's going on because you really just don't know what to expect yet. You're unable to trust it. And so someone who is abusive and manipulative will hone in on those wounds and will really try to make you feel secure and will do the extra work that a healthy person really wouldn't be doing so early on in a relationship. And so the person with the abandonment wound will read this as, wow, they are really there for me. This person is really showing up. They're really applying pressure. They're really consistently reaching out to me, and maybe you talk all day in the beginning, and you're really bypassing the time that it takes to really establish trust with someone that you're still getting to know. And for someone who is anxiously attached and has an abandonment wound, it feels better for them to bypass all that other stuff. They just want to be able to trust you. And so if you show up falsely and manipulatively and with masks on, then they will allow themselves to attach to somebody in that way. And then someone who has a healthy, which is called a secure attachment, when someone with an abandonment wound meets someone who has a healthier background, has done the work, and they are securely attached, they just may not be as responsive as the person with the abandonment wound needs them to be. They need them to reach out more. They need them to really show them that they're there with them. There's an insecurity there as they're attaching to them. And so the person with the abandonment wound might say, this person's not interested in me. I hear from him every 3 days. Please, I'm not going to waste my time. And not realizing that that's really a healthier form of attachment. And so they will attach themselves to people consistently who will fulfill that prophecy of the belief that they have in their programming. So the last or fourth major childhood wound that we see is the betrayal wound. And that wound forms by having caregivers who consistently break their promises to you. Pretty self-explanatory. Maybe your dad promises he's going to pick you up, and your mom promises that she's not going to be doing something anymore. It's just going to be this from now on going forward. And then within a few weeks, it's back to the same old. People who consistently break your promises, yes, I'm going to buy you that. And then, no, I'm sorry, I can't get it for you. That will affect your ability to trust in people and their words. So that is where that covert feeling or tendency to be jealous and envious of people comes from. When you are not able to trust that people will come through for you, you become envious when you see that people come through for other people. So you may not necessarily be jealous of their car or their house or their clothes, but you might have this tendency to be envious that you see a really close marriage or a boyfriend and girlfriend who really show up for each other. Things like that may trigger those emotional wounds that you have of how come not me? Why don't people show up for me? I can't even trust my mom or dad. How can I trust someone else when I can't even trust my parents? So people who have a betrayal wound also have that constant feeling of unworthiness. With these four childhood wounds, in all of them, there's this tendency to put the blame on themselves of these things happened to me because of something I did. Because as a child, your emotional capacity, you're still learning to understand your world. And so when someone who is supposed to nurture you and take care of you and someone that you love hurts you in some way, your mind is trying to rationalize that understanding of, well, then it must be something I'm doing because they love me and I love them. So maybe if I just did this, they would love me. They would show up for me. They would come through for me. They wouldn't abandon me. And or they wouldn't reject me. They wouldn't criticize me. If maybe you had a parent who constantly criticized you and compared you to other children. Everyone that they were around was better. Oh, how come you can't be like them, John? Oh, John, do you see, so and so what they're doing? How come you can't be like that? That's a form of rejection in childhood, and it really does wound us and how we view ourselves. So the ways that I'm sorry, I thought I did all four, but that was third. The fourth childhood wound is the injustice wound. And the injustice wound develops in an environment where your caregivers are cold and authoritarian. So your needs are inconsistently met. You have a parent who maybe is hot and cold with you, or maybe they're just always cold and they're not very affectionate and they're always barking orders. They come home and they're in your ass telling you what to do. Being raised in an environment like that really makes you rigid. It makes you very tense. And people with this wound tend to seek out power and things that make them feel important. They want to feel needed. They want to also be in control. They want to also be in power. This personality trait will present as the perfectionist, people who have to be perfect at anything. But yet at the same time, they may have a really hard time with making decisions. So again, the feelings of unworthiness when you really are not nurtured. There's an injustice there. There's an injustice to your needs as a child growing up and the amount of touch that you need from your caregivers in order to have healthy brain development. And so you try to become what you see and mimic it in some way. I also am important. I also can be in power and authoritarian. And the sad part is that we tend to recreate these dynamics with our children. As much as they hurt us growing up, as much as we condemned our own parents for the way they treated us, our inner voice really is the sound of our parents. And so when we become parents, that inner voice becomes the voice in which we speak to our children. And that is where generational trauma begins. We start passing on the emotional wounds, the emotional programming or viruses, limiting beliefs into our children, generation after generation. And we really see families that are stuck in generational trauma presenting with a lot of health ailments. People who suffer from generational trauma will have a shorter life expectancy. And we see people who suffer from generational trauma. I forgot my thought there. With a lot of inflammation. Families that have a tremendous amount of history with trauma will tend to have such a variety of inflammatory diseases, inflammation of the organs, allergies and rashes, constant inflammation of the skin, inflammation of the muscles and tissues, bones. Inflammatory diseases really have been correlated to trauma. So we really need to start understanding, when we see families who continue suffering from the same things, when we say I have a genetic predisposition, those genes, we used to think that genes dictated what the human body experience was going to be, but it's really the opposite. What we're now understanding with science is that the human body experience writes the code to those genes. So now we're finding that genes can be rewritten, DNA can be recoded, and it's through healing that that's done. So in my next video, I'm going to go into the types of trauma responses that we respond with. And some of us have heard of the flight or fight response, and that is the most commonly discussed response. But there's also the freeze and fawn response. So I'll just quickly brush over them, but that will be my next video. So the fight response, when we are triggered, when one of these emotional wounds are triggered, we may become defensive. We may become aggressive, overly aggressive with people. We may physically fight. I know that in my younger years, I had a lot of rage in me, and I was a fighter, believe it or not. People are often surprised to hear that, but I was very defensive. I really could not handle criticism, and I was easily triggered and provoked. If you spoke to me a certain way, I had a motto of, I meet your energy. You come at me a certain way, I'm going to come back at you that way. If I encountered someone in the street and they, insulted me, then the game was on. And what I didn't understand was how we really create our reality with our mind, and how we're really attracting experiences that confirm and validate our programming. And that's the mystery of life that we really have lost our connection to, is understanding that what we believe is what we're going to see. So if we believe that the world is aggressive, if we believe that people are shitty, we are going to attract experiences like that. So as I healed myself and kind of backed out of that thinking mentality, I don't have those experiences anymore. And what does that mean? All those people went away? No, it's just that I'm not on that belief programming anymore. I'm not on that vibe anymore. So I'm traveling on a totally different highway from people who still believe in that programming. So when you change your thinking, you change the things that you're able to attract to you. So the fight response is a response that we see a lot, and it's something we see a lot in adolescence. because there's really not a sense of self-control developed yet. As we're younger, it's harder to have that self-control. We're very impulsive. Um, and so we see a lot of young adults go to that response. Um, for some, we have a flight response where when we're triggered by something, we're up and out. We disappear. And some of us will use or respond in all four different types of trauma ways, trauma responses. I've done all. I've done fight, I've done flight, I've done fawn, I've done freeze. So for the flight response, maybe things get hot and heavy and you're out of there. You can't deal with it. Conflict is something, it just overwhelms you. You can't do it. So for myself, when I first started trying to not fight, if I sensed conflict and tension, I was out of there. I didn't want to deal with it. I knew that I was easily angered. I knew that I had an issue with rage. And until I could calm down, I had to get myself out of the environment. I would run, literally. And so we see this in people as they get older with people who have a tendency to move. If something hard happens in their community or they have a breakup, they're out of there. They're moving to the next location. They're on to something better. They have an issue with a job, they're out of there. They're running to the next job. And that is part of the flight response. Another type of response is the freeze response. So the freeze response can be characterized by obviously freezing up. Something stressful happens and you're checking out. Um, so we can see this in people who tend to disassociate, people who will go through something stressful, something aggravated you during the day, and now you're on the couch and you're just scrolling, scrolling endlessly. You're not even reading what you're scrolling. You're literally just scrolling. You are totally somewhere else. You've disassociated, you've checked out, and people can stay in the freeze response for really months on end. You really can be stuck in a freeze response where you're unable to clean, you're unable to take care of yourself. You set these goals for yourself. Tomorrow I'm going to get up and clean. Tomorrow I'm going to go and do groceries. I'm going to go handle the things that I need to handle. And then the next day comes and you're sitting at the edge of your bed and you're just completely zoned out. You just can't seem to snap out of it and do the things you need to do. And so when we see that, we see people who are stuck in the freeze response. The next response is the fawn response. And I think I lived a good part of my life in the fawn response. It became very comfortable for me. I finally figured out a way where I wasn't angry. I wasn't the one filled with rage. I wasn't running. This worked for me well after I had children because I didn't want to fight in front of my children. I didn't want to run out of a house where my children were in. I couldn't just pick up and go anymore. And so freezing wasn't always easy to do when you have children. You got to get up, you got to cook, you got to do laundry, you got to take them to school, you have homework to do, so you can't really freeze. But the fawning response for me became really my go-to because it's so subtle. A fawn is, think of a deer. What does a deer do when they fawn? They just, like a deer in headlights. So a fawn, it can become very submissive. They can play up to people's moods. If I knew that you were in a bad mood, I would, pretend I didn't see it. I would become very helpful. I would anticipate your needs, get things prepared, do whatever I needed to do to make sure that the people around me were stable and not moving into conflict. Um, it's almost like living in a state of denial of what you really see. You're just doing everything you need to do to keep everything okay. And so we see this in a lot of women or in people who are too into their feminine energy, will really have this fawn response to the trauma and pain that they're going through. And sometimes we can see it in other people. We're watching them from afar and the ever so helpful person and tending and the caregiver, fawning over everyone, the consummate host. She's taking care of everyone. She can't sit still. And fawning, is another way that we reduce our anxiety. So just to cover what I went through today, we just covered the 4 major childhood wounds, which were rejection, abandonment, betrayal, and injustice. And I talked about the 4 trauma responses, which were fight, flight, fawn, and freeze. And we talked about the types of symptoms that we show when we have these types of childhood wounds. And the main one really is the lack of sense of self-worth and self-concept. So I'm going to continue every time I do a video breaking down these topics more and more and really going into depth on the types of behaviors and personalities that form from these types of childhood wounds. And my goal for that is that we will be able to begin to see what types of personalities or traits we ourselves have developed and understand a little bit more about where they came from. Sometimes we can reverse engineer what we don't understand about our childhood. For instance, if you have a habit of repressing memories, or if you had parents who really gaslit you and kind of really always, convinced you that the things you remember didn't happen as you remembered. And so your memory of your childhood is a little fuzzy, or maybe your parents have matured through the years and you have a really good relationship with them. And so you've forgotten a lot of the things that you went through as a child, but yet here are these behaviors and personalities. So sometimes by understanding who we are today, we can reverse engineer to understand where those behaviors come from and say, I must have gone through that at some point in my life. Is that the case? And we can start to begin to explore those questions that come up for us. And I encourage everyone in this group to really buy a journal. I cannot tell you how many journal books I have around my house. I have a little bit of an addiction. I have them everywhere. I have several, and I write in them whenever, wherever. I sit one by my bed. If I wake up and I have a crazy dream at night, I write about it. I really keep them everywhere because they're a great way to really get in touch with what you're feeling. And they're also a great way to start reprogramming the mind as if you are already in a place of healing and you are already in the place that you envision for yourself. So for instance, I have journals where I write about my day. I write about my feelings, how I was feeling, my mood, things that happened, things that may have triggered me, how I responded, how I wish I would have responded. Excuse me. But I also have a journal where I talk about things in the future tense. I write about things as if they've already happened. I write about my week as if it's already happened. I write about my day to day. If I'm meeting new people or developing new relationships with friends, I write about them as if they've already happened and how I best envision them to happen. And by doing that, we really begin to take control of the constant chatter in our heads, which everyone has. And what we don't realize is that's really the seat of where some people say that's how the devil gets into our brain, whatever your beliefs are, but that really is the seat of where our future issues come from. When we spend all day in our head thinking about things that have happened, what we don't realize is that the way this world works is that we're creating more of that. So when we obsess and ruminate over these thoughts, we'll go into obsessive thoughts in a couple of days. When we obsess and ruminate over things that have happened and what's to come with our anxiety, we're creating more of those experiences. But by writing out what we want to happen and the way we want it to happen and to flow, we are now creating our future. We have now taken control of our mind and our destiny. And so the mind is a tool. And if we don't use it to create with our imagination, then it will create on autopilot. And that autopilot is just pulling out things from the subconscious, which is where your programming is. And if your programming has viruses in it, then it's constantly creating a future that's distorted and is reinforcing the viruses that are in your mind. So get a journal, write about your day, and then write about your week to come, your month to come. You're thinking about a new job. You're thinking about a new relationship or getting out of a relationship or your children. Write about them in the way that you best hope for, because that's the type of thinking that you want to get to. And you will get to it with these little habits. You will get to it by training your mind. The mind is a muscle. It has to be trained. It's a tool that we need to use. And we need to stop allowing it to use ourselves by us just going into this autopilot. So those are my thoughts for today. And I thank you for walking with me. And I look forward to jumping on here within the next few days to go into some of these topics in a little bit more depth. Thank you guys. Bye.